Okay, seems to me that everybody more or less is back from the rooms. Now, I must apologize. There was some technical glitch with Zoom. So it seems to me that not everybody was assigned to a breakout room. So I hope that it is like, I was able to sneak peek into a couple of rooms and saw that there was like some discussion. So I hope you had the chance to reflect on this question. But anyway, so like, I mean, I could see that there was some discussion ongoing anyway, like, in the breakout room. So what kinds of thoughts or ideas did you have about this? Like, why would you want to write a book? And does somebody want to volunteer to start sharing what you talked about in your breakout room?
I can start. My name is Jenny. I just finalized my thesis about remote employee experience, and the topic is super interesting, and I think it could be interesting for many. And that's why I would like to share what I know and make work life better, but also practically to build my career.
Okay, so are you thinking about like converting the thesis to a book?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, that's definitely a great idea. Like, if you already have some good research to back it up, and like, that you can actually like expand it into, for example, a mass audience. I mean, that's actually what often researchers do when they come by with something like cool in their research, that they start like figuring out how to make it more approachable for other people. And I'm seeing also like lots of like points in the chat, so that's great also. So let me just write that down. Sharing knowledge, engaging with others, summarize their thoughts. I love this, like, this is kind of like, I think for me personally, like one of the biggest takeaways from writing a book is that usually, like, you understand things in one way when you start, and then when you finish, you realize that you've really expanded your, it's not just about like, that, hey, I have these ideas and I just want to like, put them out in the world, but it's a kind of an interactive sort of like feedback loop that goes on when you're processing the information. And when you come out of that, two things happen. So first of all, you'll be somehow like more deeply vested in the understanding of like what you were thinking. But one thing, like I mentioned before, is like once you write a book, you're sort of stuck with it for life. And the other interesting thing is like that sometimes, I mean, I don't really go that much back into my old books, but sometimes I might like leaf through one of them and then just realize that, wait a second, so I wrote this in 2011, like that's weird. Like that like I had like there's a bunch of stuff that I had completely forgotten about, like that I was really excited about like 10 years ago. And once you have that documented into something that's like cohesive and easy to read, that's like that's, I think, a really cool takeaway. Summarize your thoughts, then spreading ideas. Why would you want to spread ideas, by the way? I mean, that's something that I'm like, really intrigued about. Like, I mean, we are actually quite keen on spreading ideas with one another. I mean, we want to go, we go to a bar and we want to tell everybody what we think about, like, I don't know, politics or science or whatever. And why is that? Would anybody venture to, guess why we want to spread ideas?
I guess sometimes there is demand for more cohesive summaries and takes on certain topics. So having a book on them is helpful, because otherwise you just have PDFs or chapters on some topic. So yeah, a book is a synthesis of what you think about the topic, or it can be. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
I look at it from the other angle is to diverge ideas and to offer more spectrum about a certain topic from different point of view. So a 360 to offer diversity for thoughts in the society.
Yeah. That's actually pretty cool, because I think like in terms of like like sharing ideas, there seems to be a kind of a paradox ongoing there. So on one hand, it's kind of like we share ideas because we're excited about something and we want other people to get excited about it. I mean, we're basically social beings, so we want to kind of get on the same level. But I think there's also this kind of like this idea that at least I don't know if you guys share this, but personally, I feel like, that when I'm excited about something, I mean, that's like one motivation about sharing. I think like, hey, this is really cool. Like, what do you guys think? But the other thing is like that I'm also like almost always when I really get, worked out by some idea, I'm a little like unsure about it. And that's, I think, one of the biggest reasons of like, why I would want to share my ideas is not just to like, kind of like, to kind of like proclaim the truth into the world, but also to test out ideas, to figure out like, what do you guys think? Does this make any sense? That's why I was like maybe like also so nervous about preparing this workshop is like, that I have this feeling that like, many of these things that I want to share with you are like really cool, but it's also like really scary, like, sharing them with a big bunch of people, because then if it turns out that like, there's some like, stupid flaws there or something like that. So that's like, it's intimidating. And I think it's kind of like, the part of the bargain is like, that you really sort of like, I mean, if you don't put yourself into, like, put your skin into the game when you're writing, then what you're writing is probably not going to be that interesting. And I think this feedback loop between the sort of like, being excited about something, but also being kind of like a little wary about that at the same time, I think that's a kind of almost like a beautiful paradox of writing and sharing ideas. Let me see, there's making a contribution. That's nice. Yeah, that's also like, I think like, one of the key motivations. This is like, I mean, my friend Frank Martela has been doing a lot of research about like, why people like, find some activities meaningful. And I think like, if you feel that you're doing something that, basically like Frank's basic thesis that people have this intrinsic motivation, like psychological need of benevolence, so doing good in the world, and like, making a contribution about like something that you understand and like being able to share that with people. I think that's also a very important motivation. Oh, I love this, exploring your thoughts. I did my postdoc thesis and the book about that I did on this dual processing theories of the mind. And it's really like, I think this is one of the key theories if you really want to understand how creativity works and how like, how to probe your like non-conscious mind for ideas. I think like, understanding that, we do so much of our thinking without being aware of that. And I love this piece of research from 1986 by this guy called Manfred Zimmerman, who was analyzing this afferent and efferent nervous system connections, and he came up with these figures that like, the ratio of conscious and non-conscious cognitive processing is in the ballpark of 1 per 280,000. So for each conscious idea or thought that you have at any given moment, your like non-conscious mind, so basically all the other structures in the brain are kind of processing like 280,000 thoughts. So that's sort of like, I think like for me, it was for a long time, it was a huge mystery about like, where do ideas come from? Like why do we wake up in the middle of the night? And then when you start to understand how dual processing works, and there's like a bunch of literature, I think like, I bet many of you have read Danny Kahneman's book on called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is like a really great primer or introduction into these theories. And that sort of like, really gives you an understanding of like, where do ideas come from? And also like, when we go to the tools, I think it'll give you, or the process will give you an understanding of how I've structured, why I've structured this process this way and not some other way. Finding limits and potential of your thinking, amazing. I would venture also to push, like, say that it's also pushing the boundaries, pushing the limits of your thoughts. Like, you're expanding the horizons when you're writing. I want to tell a story. That's by the way, that's really interesting. I'll stop there before I go to the next one. So like, why is telling a story so important? And like now I'm gonna have to like put my hands up in the air. So if you guys have an answer to that, I would actually love to hear that. Because sorry, go ahead.
So if you took it from my written text, so meaning that to me there is a kind of at least one phenomenon, maybe several phenomenon that I would want to share. And it's not that I want to say this thing, but this should be known. And it's very much like in separate discussions with some of you guys who are now present, we have been discussing about art. So if I'm making music, I think this is what the song or tune needs to be like. Not that I want to express myself, but this is what should kind of be developing. And this is also what I think about especially non-fiction books, that there's a phenomenon that should be known. And this is, I'm thinking about the phenomenon, not what I want to say, but what needs to be said about the phenomenon.
Yeah, makes total sense. And I think, like, also, like, there's a kind of a like two ways to look at this. Like, when you're talking about phenomena that are sort of like, real phenomena, like, then when you're writing nonfiction, that's kind of like, sort of, expanding people's capabilities and understanding. But what really perplexes me is though, like, this like, stories like in the literal meaning, like fiction. I love this, like, this dedication in Stephen King's novel It, and it goes like, that I don't remember it like word for word, but he says like, something to the effect of like, that, hey kids, fiction is the truth in the lie. And I'm like, my hair is like standing up, like when I'm just like saying that, like fiction is the truth in the lie. And it's kind of like, I mean, because fiction is obviously a lie. I mean, something you made up, you concocted it. And yet, like, there is like fiction that can be truthful, like fiction that can be untruthful. And for me personally, like, this is like super scary talking about this, especially because like I might never actually ever publish any of my pictures and stuff, because I think most of it is still pretty crap. But anyway, but I mean, I feel like, that when I'm writing, like, I have this like space opera thing that I've been writing. I wrote like one novel about it, and the second one is like halfway through, and it's about this space pirates. Like, I'm a geek and a little child inside, so what, but I don't feel like I'm making this up when I'm sitting by my typewriter. I feel like, I have this little window, and I'm looking through that window into this world where these like kilometer-long spaceships are fighting against one another. And I'm just trying to document what I'm seeing through that window. And like I said, I have no idea why. I don't have any idea why that happens. So I'm not like a great authority to give advice on writing fiction, obviously. But I think, like, that there's like, I mean, obviously there are similarities and you're using the same tools, but there's like, it's really, like 20 years ago, I was totally perplexed about where ideas come from. And then I figured out, like, I think dual processing theory really like opened that out for me. But for fiction, I still have not the faintest idea why would somebody want to write a fictitious account? Why would somebody want to deliberately lie to other people? But yet, like, perhaps in Stephen King's vein, in a truthful way. I don't know. If you guys do, like, please like send me a note, or like, let's have a chat about that, because I would love to understand that better. I'm gonna pick up a couple of more from here, and then there's there we go, self-expression. That's a good one. I think self-expression, there's Socrates says in the Apology by Plato, he says that, like, life left unexamined is a life not worth living. And I think, like, self-examination and self-expression go sort of hand in hand. And self-expression, I think it's sort of, it makes us more real. It makes us more tangible if we put ourselves out there and express, like, what we think about things. And in a sense, because, I mean, once again, we're social. We're actually, I believe strongly that we're actually systemic creatures. So we're sort of like, the whole way our cognitions are connected is much more intricate than, like, that we were taught in school. And putting yourself out there, it's, it sort of makes you more real. And the kind of like the main thesis. Now, I'm sorry, I'm going to do just a quick segue. So in the variously patterned fictions book, the main thesis was that actually, like, half of what you know is reality, and the other half is fictitious. So even the reality is half fictitious. And this, like, there's a bunch of research that actually, like, shows that is the case. Well, for example, like, if you look into perceptual psychology, or the psychology of perception, you'll see that. So my dad is like he's a professor emeritus of neuroscience, and he used to run these, like, these experiments where we would have people read a piece of text. And, back in the day, people used to think that when you're reading, you're scanning the lines like that, but actually you're not. You're scanning, your eyes are darting here, there, and there. And you're making up a bunch of that stuff. Just happened to me this morning. I was reading a piece of stuff, like something on my cell phone. And I thought that there was, like, this saying that he sat on a wall And I read a big bunch of this text before I, like, there was another formulation where it read that he sat on a wall, on a well curb. And then I went back, and the whole image, I was thinking that this is like, we're talking about the wall and we're actually talking about the well. So that was kind of like interesting. And even your everyday perception works the same way. So you're making up actually a bunch of stuff, even though you think that, what you're seeing, that, these are the hands right here, but you're actually like, you're constructing a lot of that. Anyway, that was a kind of a segue to that. I won't go deeper into that, but like that was like one of the main theses of the more like harder books that I wrote. Let me see if I can pick a couple of more. Telling a story implies calling for action. Oh, that's nice. Digital course is that's true. Like, I mean, it's also like, that like, sorry. So like, I mean, other forms of self-expression also benefit from this, like, way we parse information and like create coherent wholes and coherent narratives about it. So I think, like, this is not maybe just about book writing, but for, for the purposes of today's theme, we will be focusing most on books. Cool, but I think that's like, that's a really like amazing bunch of stuff here about book writing. Oh, just a second. And I really love this, like, this kind of like diversity of points of views towards, like, what writing a book looks like. Why would you want to do that? And then, like, really sort of like ranging from, being able to express yourself, being able to share your thoughts, being able to, like, develop your thoughts, being able to have an impact, telling a story, and so on and so forth. And I think it's really important, like, that when we start to write a book, that we have an understanding of, like, what is all of this, what is all of this for? Because, I mean, it is quite a big endeavor. It's like, it's a huge building process, in my opinion, to write a book, and to just have an idea, like, why am I doing this in the first place? And what I would really like, want to underline is that there was like, I was in 2013 in Los Angeles in this Congress for Positive Psychology, and there, like, I was sitting at a counter in a bar, and the guy next to me was reading this book called Steal Like an Artist by Austin Kleon. I'd never heard of Austin Kleon before, and I had just asked this guy to take a look at the book, because he had the book open, and in these huge letters there was written, I don't know how many of you guys know this book, but it's a tremendous little book, but really tremendous book about creativity. And Austin Kleon had written, like, in the margin, like, that write what you know, and then he'd slashed out know and replaced it with, I think it was love. And I think that should be the kind of, like, if there's one key takeaway, like, on the kind of meta level of book writing, I think that should be it. Like, that you should never really, write for a career or write for, for your work or for your job, even if you're doing it, for your career or for your job or something like that. But you should always seek to write something, like, find that, the truth within the lie or the truth within the truth. So that's some, like, deeper understanding inside you that you personally care about. And that's why I think, like, spending some time thinking about the motivations of, like, why you're writing in the first place is, like, super important. Cool. So let's move to the next topic. So just a second. So I've prepared, like, a bunch of, like, or some like, notions about, like, how I think the creativity works, and so basically, many of these constructions are actually from this book. This is unfortunately only in Finnish, something that I wrote with my younger brother Paavo, that was published last year. So this book is called BIM, Olet Luova, or Being Your Creative. And we basically went through, like, trying to understand, like, why should you be creative in the first place, what creativity is, and then, like, how can you use, a variety of different kinds of tools to, to really, like, support your creativity. So if you parse Finnish, I would, like, really encourage you to take a look at that book, because it is kind of, like, chock full of different kinds of tools. Some of them I'll share with you today, but, like, also obviously, like, in a workshop for 2 hours, I don't really have the luxury of like delving deep into how this stuff works. So if you want to understand it more deeply, then like I think the book is a good source for that. If you're not like, you know, if you don't parse finish, then I would, you know, for example, recommend well, a great book by Michael Michalko called Tinker Toys, that is like full of these kind of tips and tricks that you can use to really like, you know, get the creative juices flowing. But the kind of like the two key takeaways that I would love to share with you before we go to the actual creative or the book writing process is that first of all, we are all creative. So, I mean, by virtue of being a human being, we have the capability of being able to act differently when we're facing a problem. And the problem with many people is that they think that they're not creative because they often, you know, don't face problems they need to solve. And that's why, like, you know, they tend to, you know, live everyday life, you know, in the same way. Like Esa Saarinen has this really amazing, like, saying that, you know, of the people are like uomakipittäjä, like, you know, running in trove runners. And we are all, you know, William James writes in his Principles of Psychology that, like, you know, the ultimate like the kind of like ultimate characterization of human beings is that we are creatures of habit. So we tend to do things in a certain way when it works, and often it works, so we don't really vary that. But having said that, we all have the capability of doing things differently. And now if you methodically actually like learn to use that capability, that means that you can actually do creative stuff. Then the second thing is that people often wonder where ideas come from. So I spent 10 years in the music industry. I have like hundreds of songs on Teosto in my name. I produced like over 60 different productions, did a lot of TV shows, you know, pop and rock albums, stuff like that. And I had absolutely no idea where, you know, when I go to the studio, why do I get a melody in my head? And then I had this conversation in I think it was in like 99 or year 2000 with Otto Donner, who was like one of my mentors back in the day, who was this kind of like grand old man in the Finnish music industry. And I asked Otto, like, you know, that, you know, where do melodies come from? And he was like, you know, I think he was like 60 at that point or something like that. And he was like, I have no idea. And I was shocked. Like, here we have this guy who's like, you know, the founder of Love Records, so like, you know, like having created this iconic like musical phenomena, like, you know, in dozens in Finland, and he doesn't have an answer to this conundrum. And it took me another, I don't know, 10, 11 years before I actually found that answer. And I found it actually, like, you know, in the research of this guy called Jonathan Evans, who's like one of the pioneers of dual processing. And I'm sure you all know this difference. I won't go into the nuts and bolts of it, but like, you know, basically we have not just one mind, but two minds, like, you know, what the scientists are like, Keith Sanovich poetically named these two systems, system 1 and system 2. And so system 2 is our conscious mind that can only process like, you know, 47 items of information at a time. And system 1 is the non-conscious mind where the, you know, the processing capacity is not really known. We don't know how much is it. We only know, like, you know, if you take a look at the research from the last 3 decades or so, we know that it's like, you know, it's just ginormous. So our non-conscious mind can process a phenomenal amount of information. It can do it fast, and it then posts, like Keith Sanovich writes in his Robust Rebellion, a great book about dual processing, by the way, that then the system 1 posts the end result into the system 2. So that's how we become conscious of these ideas. And that's, you know, that's the explanation of why do you wake up in the middle of the night with going, hey, now I get it. Or why, like, you know, why you're in the shower in the morning. I actually had to buy like waterproof paper at some point in our shower because my wife was so peeved about me, like, you know, wetting the floor when I was like, you know, getting an idea in the shower and rushing out to write it down in my little notebook. So I think the dual processing paradigm really explains to us, like, you know, where ideas come from and how do you generate them. And now the key takeaway is, first of all, that, you know, we all get great ideas, but we don't all use them. And that's why, you know, some people seem to be more creative than others. And then the second one is that if you really, really want to get great ideas, it's not just enough to, like, you know, to lean back and trust your, like, you know, your trustworthy system 1, but you also have to, you know, you have to basically put stuff in there. So you have to really dive deep into whatever you want to write about, and really, like, you know, subject yourself to heated conversations and like, you know, if you're a bookworm like me, the way I, sort of stock my system one is I just read like a ton. Watching movies, watching documentaries, like, listening to online courses, whatever, but like, just make sure that you are like subjecting yourself to a variety of different kinds of sources of ideas. And then this is actually already from like, I mean, it's astonishing, like, if you really want to read a piece of prescient literature, James's Principles of Psychology from, I think, late 1890s, already like describes a lot of these processes. Like, William James didn't have an fMRI scanner at his disposal in the late 19th century, and yet he was able to come up with this really tremendous understanding of how, like, basically the system one processes information through repetition and association. And that's like, that's why we get these novel ideas when we have been reading a lot and talking a lot and like, subjecting ourselves to new sources of information. Because these things tend to sort of mull in the system one and eventually come, you'll come up with new combinations. And everybody gets great ideas. But the difference is whether you like, you put in the effort to really like, to stock up your system one. And then especially, and this is what I'm going to be emphasizing a lot in just a minute as well, is that like, that the biggest difference between people who who participate in creative endeavors and those who don't, is that the previous usually write down their ideas as soon as they occur. And now if you think about it, like, that I would venture to say that the ballpark figure of the ratio between system 1 and 2 is somewhere in the ballpark of like Zimmerman's 1 per 280,000 to even 1 per millions. And that means that if you don't write an idea down at the very moment that it catches up with you, you might lose it for life. And I at least personally, I hate that. It's an obnoxious feeling, like, that you have an idea, you get distracted, and then for the rest of the day, you might spend, I've had that, like, spending weeks or months trying to like figure out I'm sure it was a great idea. And in 2008, when I started using Evernote as my sort of like treasure trove of ideas, after that, like, I've actually discovered two things. So first of all, you do forget ideas if you don't write them down immediately. And second of all, when you have that aha, it turns out that those ideas actually are pretty damn good in the long run. You might not be able to use them right now, but like, if you put them into an idea archive, you might be able to, like, really profit from them like 10 years from now. And the most hilarious thing is that this book here has some actual, like, sentences that I have written into my, notebook in the middle of the street in the year 2008. And then I've moved them into the idea archive, tagged them. And then when we started writing this book, we, dug out everything that I had stored about the, tag of creativity. And some of those sentences went into this book that I have actually written in the middle of the street in 2008. So that's kind of like, that's kind of a cool phenomenon. And one more thing before we go to the process. So people often think that creativity is kind of like, fooling around and like, like being like, playful and diverse. And actually, like, at least my experience is that creativity looks roughly like, what this graph that my brother drew is on the screen. So, I mean, you need to start with playfulness. You need to start with divergence. You can't just dive right into creating the end result. And I believe that is the kind of main reason why we actually, like, get writer's block in the first place, is that when you're looking at the empty screen and you either know what the end results should look like, you've all read books that are amazing, or you've even written stuff that's amazing yourself, and you compare what you put on screen to that already, like, refined and finalized stuff, and it just doesn't match up. And then you start being overly critical about it, and then you freeze up. And at least that used to happen to me all the time before I learned about this process. So understanding that we have to start with divergence, but the closer we come to the end of the creative process, the more focused we need to be. And in the end, we have to be like hypercritical. And this kind of like, pendulum movement, first of all, understanding the paradox of creativity of being both hyper playful and hypercritical, and then understanding that the process moves back and forth between the two. I think, like, is at least for what was for me one of the key takeaways in, like, finally understanding how to parse how creativity works. Cool. So let's look at the book writing process next, unless you have some. Do you have any questions about what I've said so far? Okie dokie. So next up, so this is the process that I ended up with back in the day, in 2008, 2009, when I started looking into this. And these 5 steps are sort of like, I mean, it doesn't mean that you linearly, like, you start with collection, then selection, then sketching, then refining, and then boom, you have a book. My brother actually like drew this. Let me see actually if I can find this in the book, because I think this is kind of like, the more realistic depiction of how the creative process works. So he drew this bit here first. Can you see the book? So this is kind of like, the kind of linear progression. And then the next graph that he drew was how we actually created this particular book. And that looks like that. Can you see that? So that's sort of like, I think that the key takeaway here is that you can identify divergent and convergent phases in creativity. You can identify tools that work for each of these phases. And you can even roughly identify that which of these phases you're in. But ultimately, you need to go back and forth between like one and the other until you come to a conclusion where you're comfortable enough letting your book go out into the world. So these 5 steps are, in my experience, like something that are really useful to understand, and especially like realizing which of these steps you are participating in right now will give you also the pointers about whether you should be more or less critical about what you're doing. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the ultimate 100% sure cure against writing block. Well, I'm kidding. Nothing is 100%, but it's almost. It's not like 99. Don't start here. Okay. So whatever you do, if you really want to make the most out of the creative process, I think the biggest hurdle for all creative people is that we rush to sketching. And that's like, that's exactly what happens when you open up a new Word screen and you start to try to write. And when you do that, I mean, it's actually pretty, like, the reason to that is pretty clear cut. We want to get to sketching as soon as possible, because sketching is actually the first love of the creative process. It's the one, like, it's like the romantic Hollywood movie when the fanfares go off and you start feeling this amazing feeling in your chest. And like, especially, if you're writing a book and when you get your first sketch ready and you have, I don't know, 250 pages of amazing stuff that you put on paper. I mean, we all want to get there, right? But if you rush into that and you haven't collected enough raw material before you get to that, you're going to have a huge problem with the white paper. And then the other thing is, like, that when you start sketching, and you don't produce final results immediately. At least most of us don't. Maybe there are some, like, people who have written like hundreds of books and they can, like, just churn out like ready-made copy immediately. But most of us, like mere mortals, we can't do that. And look, like what really like differentiates a professional writer from an amateur writer is that the professional is capable, first of all, of holding back from sketching before they have enough raw material to move forward. And second of all, they don't get stuck with sketching. So the amateur is somebody who rushes to sketching, struggles to get started, finally gets started, put something on paper, and then when they get to the end and put the final period, like, when they have what Aristotle said in Poetics, like, the beginning, the middle part, and the end, then they go like, yay, I'm done. Sort of like, my science fiction novel. It's, it's quote unquote done because it's like 350 pages and it's like, full of, amazing space battles, but it's, it's not done yet. Okay. That's why I'm an amateur fiction writer, because I haven't yet been able to learn the tools to figure out how to finalize that into a form that, would be playable for anybody else, but, me and my family. Poor things those, by the way, because they actually have to read that stuff, So sorry about that. So I think the key takeaway here is, like, that like if you want to take home 2 methods that are really going to be groundbreaking, or that at least were for me. The first one is that don't rush to sketching. So don't start here, start with collection. And the second one is that always keep a notebook with you wherever you go. And that includes the shower, if you want to really like, take this literally. And then and like, because when you get an idea, it might be, a matter of life and death in 2 seconds for that idea if you don't write it down. But when you start writing it down, and especially when you start collecting this idea archive, you will eventually have so much stuff like, after 12 years of collecting ideas, I have more than 22,000 notes in my idea archive. It's a little complicated. I'll run you through the nuts and bolts of how this works and why it's not actually in one place right now, but that's another story I'll get into in a moment. But anyway, so like, with 22,000 notes in the database that are actually sorted through these idea tags, it's like super easy to start writing anything new. And like, somebody asked me for a blog post and I go to like, so, okay, let's see, like a blog post about sustainable innovation in startups. And I go, look, what do I have for sustainability and startups and innovation? And then, I have the first sketch ready in like 5 minutes, and then people are like, how did you write this in like 30 minutes? And I'm like, I didn't write it in 30 minutes. I wrote it in 12 years. But you're only seeing that 30 minutes because like, you have all of that stuff prepared and that's it to go. So don't start with sketching. And then I'm going to run you now. I'm going to run you through these 5 steps, and I'm going to share some tools about like how these work and like, what I found to be like useful for me. But before you start the actual writing process, there's 2 things, that, especially like, if you're working with a non-fiction account and even with a fictitious account, this might make sense. So back in the day when I was starting to write my first like actual book, I mean, obviously my PhD thesis is like book length, and it is a sort of a book, but it's still like more kind of like, a proof of learning than an actual like, a book. Well, it is a book, sort of. I mean, it is printed as a book, but anyway. But when I was starting to write my first actual book called Thesis, or like, make yourself into a masterful thinker. The title is really embarrassing, to be honest, but it's like, my working title was that this is how the mind works. And my publisher thought that it wasn't like, like it wasn't marketable enough. And then they changed the title, and the book was like the 8th most sold nonfiction book in Finland. So what do you know? I guess they were right. But anyway, I mean, like, it does sound a lot like, self-help stuff, and it still kind of embarrasses me. But then again, I'm pretty happy that people, I'm actually like, people still listen to like, I don't know, 1,000 copies of that every year on BookBeat. So even after almost 10 years after the publication of the book, that's kind of cool. And the way I wrote the book was that I had an idea. So I'd been perplexed about how the mind works for ages, and I'd been especially like spending like hours with my dad, like since I was 5 years old, trying to figure that out. And then when I bumped into dual processing, like especially Evans and Stanovich, Kahneman's book was actually published, I think, the same year, the year after my book came out. So I had the luxury of tapping into that for my first book. But then I just started like, realizing, hey, this is a really cool topic, and I would really love to like put this into a book form. And I wrote a synopsis, like 1-pager about like what the book is about. I wrote like a rough table of contents, and then a couple of like sample chapters, and I sent them to a bunch of publishers, and one of them picked it up, and the rest is then like, sort of like kind of history. And so what I would encourage you to do is like, first of all, I mean, try to figure out the motivations for why you're doing this in the first place. Then just write a quick sort of like outline of what is this all about. And then why the table of contents is so cool, especially when you combine this with collection, is that you have already an idea or a semblance of structure where you start like, punching in that stuff that you're like, then writing. So first of all, like, so write a quick, 1-pager about what is this all about, and then a quick idea. And the structure is going, I mean, it's going to change a lot. Like, don't worry about that. Just like, whatever is in your head right now, just put it down on paper, and then you can start filling in the blanks. And, that's one of the most fun parts of writing a book is like, when you get to the point where you still really start hashing out your ideas and filling in the blanks and trying to make sense of like, why did I mean, this has happened to me dozens of times. Like, I've written something down, and I'm like, what does this mean? I mean, I wrote this, obviously I should know what it means, but I have no idea. And then you dwell on that, and you write some like, just random stuff there, and you go, makes sense. And that might lead to a whole new aha when you're like, sort of like, investigating those, like your own weird thought processes. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only person in the world with weird thought processes. So there you go. But anyway, and then if you write a synopsis and a kind of preliminary table of contents, that gives you already a semblance of structure. And especially then when you have a lot of raw material, which you should have if you spend enough time in the collection phase, then just sort of dropping that into that structure is going to be a really, really exciting phase in the process. And then the other thing, this is like I really recommend. I picked up 2 books about writing that I want to recommend. This is one of them. So this is the book On Writing by Stephen King. And it's half his autobiography, half his sort of like tips and tricks about like how he writes. And it's like I've read, I don't know, a dozen of these writing books, and this is, I think, like by far the best writing book that I've ever read. It's obviously more about fiction, but all of this stuff can be applied also to nonfiction. And I think the most important takeaway, by the way, Stephen King writes in the book that when authors are asked where ideas come from, they always say, I have no idea, because we don't. And, well, that's good for Stephen King, but now we know where ideas come from, so haha. But anyway, sorry about that. But so he writes there, like, that, like, if you want to be a writer, write. And that's like, I think often people, especially who aspire to write their first book, struggle with, like, that they go like I have this idea for a book and I would love to do that, but I really just, I don't have the time for that. And look, you want to be a writer, make time for that, period. And the way that works is that you carve out a regular space in your calendar. Probably, I mean, if you have a day job, probably it's, at least if you have a day job, I mean, actually a bunch of you guys probably, can manage this even in working hours, because like, in university, you're sort of supposed to write, right? But I mean, if you don't have that luxury, you need to carve out that time, usually probably either in the mornings or in the evenings, or the time after work. And like, many people go like, but I can't, I have this and this and this. And then, it all boils down to your priorities. And like, if other things are more important for you than writing a book, then don't write a book, okay? But, the book is not going to write itself. So if you want to write it, you really need to carve out time for that. And what I would recommend, so what I've been doing is, especially lately, like, I've just sort of like dug out a couple of hours every morning. I go out, like, to jog, I eat breakfast, and I write and do stuff for a couple of hours, and then the work starts. And I'm not the morning person at all, but I actually noticed that it leaves me more energized than when I used to like wake up, like, just in time to get to work. So that's one way to do that. Previously, like, I would often like write in the evenings. I would take my computer or an iPad. Like, for example, my second book, I think I wrote most of that on beaches, because it was the summertime and it was my summer holiday, and we would go out with the kids, and like kids would go to the swimming pool or the ocean, and then I would sit there, like, you guys know this guy Amadeus from Peanuts, who's always like hunched over the piano and playing that. So I was sort of like Amadeus, but instead of the piano, I had an iPad in my lap and I was writing that book. So that's like one way to go about it. There's a great anecdote. I apologize that I don't actually have a reference for this, so it might be true, might not be true, but I think, like, it has some, I think it was actually something that Adams wrote himself at some point. But so Scott Adams, the guy who created these Dilbert comics, so he allegedly woke up like 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. or something like that, and he was working in this really, like, boring like office job, obviously collecting a ton of good material for Dilbert, right? But he would spend, like, a couple of hours every morning, like, just trying to parse through that, like, stuff into comics, and thinking that he wants, basically he thought that he wants to create the most popular comic strip in the world. And well, look how that turned out. So you guys know what Dilbert is, right? This office work sucks type of like comic strip. So that's one way to do about it. But the long and the short of it is, like, that if you want to be a writer, you need to write. And there's no shortcut around that. None of this stuff that I'm like sharing here is gonna, like, be worth one iota for any of you if you don't actually, like, put your behind down on a chair and start writing. Or I think you can write with a standing table as well, but, like, most of us old-fashioned geezers anyway do it sitting down. Important factoid there, right? But anyway, so and I think, like, with these two sort of like preparations, you're all set to go to start writing. But now here's the kind of drum roll. Now when we go to the process, actually what I would really encourage you to do is not writing, but rather do something else and start to collect material for your writing. Now, I'm going to go into the creative process in a bit, but before that, I would really love to have a quick break of 5 minutes, because I think there's been a ton of information here, a ton of stuff for us to process. So let's break for like, my clock says now it's like 2:07. So if it's okay for you guys, let's continue with the actual nuts and bolts of the creative process at precisely 2:12. Welcome back. Let's continue. So, let's dive into the process of how do you actually, like the nuts and bolts of how you actually write a book. So now, the first one of the phases in the creative process, and I think this applies like, to any creative endeavor, so it's not just book writing that it's all about. So the first one is collect stuff. I really love this passage in this Sherlock Holmes short story, The Copper Beeches, where Holmes and Watson are like, they're in a train going to this countryside, and Watson is pestering Holmes about like, what do you think is going on? So there's this governess, this lady who's like tending to the kids of the family, and there's something like, really weird going on in that place, and they're trying to figure it out. And Holmes, so Watson goes on like, Holmes, I mean, because you are such a crime-fighting genius, like, what do you think is going on? And Holmes goes like, I do not know. I need more data. You can't make bricks without clay. This is like one of my favorite sayings. You can't make bricks without clay. And, a book is a type of brick. And like, if you don't have enough clay to make that, no amount of like writing is going to get you there. So before you get to that part where you actually start writing the book, you really need to spend time collecting stuff. And that means, in my understanding, two things. So first of all, you need to, just subject yourself to as many influences as possible about what you're writing about. So that means that you're sort of like, rewiring your system by reading things, discussing it with other people. So often when people ask me like, what are the best tools for creativity? I say that read books and travel. Well, hey, look, like good luck with that right now with Corona and everything. But we can still read books, and even traveling is sort of possible. Like, you can travel to the, the closest forest, or to the, right now, actually, like, I spent time in this exotic like city of Helsinki because I live in Espoo, and I was actually in another city for like an hour yesterday. So you can even travel to another city, like, which is kind of like, can be mind-blowing. And then like, keep your eyes open. Like, when you go to new places, by the way, here's a really cool trick. Like, this is also about Helsinki. So a couple of years ago when Pokemon Go came, it was like already 4 or 5 years ago. And I started paying attention to Helsinki in a whole new way. So I was running a game studio at that point that was situated in the center of Helsinki. And then when I started to see the Pokestops there, I started to look up. And you know what? There's a whole new Helsinki, like, roughly, like, because usually you keep your eyes on the street level. And if you just look up, and you'll find the architecture. There's like, in the center, there are the gargoyles coming out of the buildings. Did you know that? How many of you guys knew that there's actually gargoyles all over Helsinki? And you can see them like, in like Fredrikinkatu, like, you just raise your eyes and you start observing like, oh gosh, like, I didn't realize that these stuff, these creatures are hiding there in the walls. So like, just like read, keep your eyes open, like, just subject yourself to as many influences as you can. And then also be mindful about the fact that, like, that the influences can be twofold. So on one hand, like, Einstein, for example, his daughter, like, in a recent piece of writing, she shared this, like, or this article, like, where she was quoted, like, that for Einstein, as it's probably pretty well known, like, the best way for him to solve problems was like when he was stuck, he would just go to his violin and spend 45 minutes, and then would put the violin down and just grunt like, now I get it. And that's like, that's how he would go about problem solving. And so one way to, like, subject yourself to influence is the divergent way. So basically just do whatever makes your, heart sing with joy. But then the other way, and this is like super important, especially if you're doing like academic work or non-fictitious work. So obviously you need to dive deep also convergently. So also like collect stuff that is relevant for the topic that's at hand. And both are highly useful. And doing this systematically, like, having a system of, like, the way I do it, for example, is that I have, because I'm like a pretty voracious reader. So I have like 3 or 4, like, professional books ongoing at any given time. And then I have this shelf at home, like, it's back there at the end of the living room, that's chock full of stuff that is like, like just, I don't know, poetry. And I have this huge book of Bob Dylan's lyrics there, and stuff that's not really like conducive to anything convergent, but that's really just sort of inspiring. And I think that these two types of like sources really play into stuff that can then materialize into something great. Then discussions obviously are like, amazing right now. Also with Corona, it's a bummer that we don't get to have them too often, at least live, but still like, just getting together with a bunch of people and just hashing out ideas like, that are relevant for whatever you're writing, like, or aspiring to write. I mean, that's amazing. Thinking together, actually like had previously I've written there brainstorming, but that's really like, I hate that word because like brainstorming is kind of like, it's a bad methodology for thinking together. And rather like, just bring a bunch of people together and instead of like, launching into this sort of like tirade of ideas, you can, for example, use post-it blocks to write down stuff so that also like, the kind of less extroverted or less like, vocal people get heard. And often like, let's face it, the more silent ones usually have the best ideas anyway. So like, that's also like, a good thing to think about. And then I think like, the kind of like the secret sauce, at least in my writing, is that like, you collect material voraciously. So whenever first of all, when I was doing my studies, I read this spectacular book about academic research by Umberto Eco called Oppineisuuden osoittaminen. So in English, roughly like, how to demonstrate your erudition. And so in the book, Umberto Eco says that like, whenever you read a book, your job is not just to read it, but you actually have to convert that object into your, basically an extension of yourself. And the way that happens is that for me, or at least like, it's impossible to read a book without a pencil in my hand. And I've developed this like system of like 5 or 6 different ways of underlining and like you're circling and like, prioritizing things in a book. And so basically, whenever you read a book, and if you come to my office, like, if that's ever possible again in the future, like, in Aalto, I can show you my like mini library at the office, and you'll see like, for example, that the stuff that, I used to read in 2008 or 2009 for my PhD research, I still have that like C.I. Lewis's analysis of knowledge evaluation. And I still have these little like, these plastic pieces inside the book so that like, if I want to quote to you a particular passage from an analysis of knowledge evaluation, it'll probably take me like, 25 seconds to find that passage because there's this like color coded plastic thingamabobs there. So like, when you are subjecting yourself to new influences, I mean, everything you sort of devour, books, documentaries, whatever, it does influence your system once, so that's already a good thing. But if you really want to make the best out of that, try to convert these things into, a literal extension of yourself. This is one of the reasons, like my wife is like, she's a trained like researcher in like ecology, and she's like, she's a big fan of libraries. I personally I love hanging around in libraries, but I could never borrow a book. That's like a horrible idea to me to borrow a book, because I mean, like, if I can't make that, first of all, like, make the book into my own book, like, with all these scribbles, and secondly, like, put it in my bookshelf after I've read it. I mean, it's a terrifying thought that I would actually like lose that bit of like, having spent a couple of days or a week with like, this amazing book of like 350 pages, and then I would lose it back into the library, like the horror. And so like, I mean, but if you make the books and, I don't know, documentaries and whatever, like, if you make them an extension of yourself, 10 years from now, they might become useful when you're writing something new. And then whenever something strikes you, like, when you have an idea in the middle of the street, when you hear an amazing quote, I often like, when I'm watching a movie and somebody says something like, really succinct, I'll just pause the movie, I'll dig out my notebook and I'll write the quote down and like, mark the time and like, mark who said it and, who's the, Al Pacino as like, some gangster in some movie or whatever. And then like later on, like, when I'm writing a book, I can like, when I have it in my idea archive, I can go into the like, what quotes I have saved there, and then this quote might end up being a part of a new book, and that's kind of fun. So basically, whenever something strikes you as interesting, write it down. Whether it's an idea that pops into your head, write it down. Whether it's something somebody else says, write it down, and please always like, make sure to ascribe credits to whoever like, says, like, even if it's your friend, I think it's a nice thing to do, like, that a friend of mine once said la la la, and then, you put that in a book, and it's a nice sort of tip of a hat to somebody who said something amazing. you know, you watch a movie, there's something amazing going on, like an amazing scenario, a scene going on. Somebody says something really smart. Somebody says something really stupid. Like whenever, you know, you just react to something, write it down. Or like, you know, if you want, I mean, you can also record it. Like, you know, all of us have probably like voice recorders in our phones. So if you don't have the chance or the opportunity really to write it down, you can use a voice recorder. For example, when you're driving a car, you probably, I might actually even like just, you know, I often just, unless I'm on the highway, I'll just park the car and stop and write it down in my phone. But basically, and keep in mind that, like, you know, it might be a matter of 5 to 10 seconds that you lose to whatever like made your heart sing. So write it down. But then, like, you know, obviously, like when you start writing down a big bunch of this stuff, at some point you'll just have such a mass of, like, you'll go from the problem of, you know, the white paper, the writer's book, to the problem of being, like, you know, avalanched by ideas. And that's why, like, you know, just writing everything down and leaving it at that doesn't really work. So you need to take it one step further, and this was something that I learned when I was reading those autobiographies by these so-called geniuses. So basically, Da Vinci, for example, like when he died, he left like tens of thousands of notes after him that were in these, like, you know, sort of like, you know, categorized notebooks that he you know, he was doing stuff in anatomy and, like, you know, building, like, you know, preambles for helicopters and whatever. And like so he had documented all of this thinking into these books, and that, you know, was, I believe, like one of the big contributors why he was able to be such a prolific inventor and scientist. But I think Thomas Edison is sort of like, you know, he sort of takes the lead in this, and probably nobody will ever catch up with him. So when Edison died, he left roughly, I think it's in the ballpark of like 5 million pages of notes. And there's a legend that goes with this, that they were organized in his library so that he could still, after, like, you know, this huge amount of, like, you know, notebooks, he could still, like, find a particular note in a matter of minutes. And I was like, there's like, you know, a whole team in the Rutgers University whose job is to investigate Edison's notes, and they have been trying to parse what the kind of like categorization system was. And based on some of the stuff that I read about this, like more than 10 years ago, I built this system in this application called Evernote, where you can actually parse through, like, you know, even those 22,000 notes I have stored there. I can, like, and I actually tested this the other day. So, like, I was thinking, like, you know, for example, in 2013, I was in this like World Congress of Positive Psychology in Los Angeles giving a talk, and one of the key, like, main keynotes was this guy called Martin Seligman, who's like basically the founder of positive psychology. And I was thinking, like, you know, so if I had to go back to what Seligman said in 2013, how long would that take me? Anybody venture to guess how long it actually took me to find that note in Evernote?
2 seconds.
Sorry?
2 seconds.
Well, I wasn't that fast. It was a little slower. It was like 15 seconds. So it was like, you know, but still. What I did was I basically went to my tag of lecture notes, to my tag of positive psychology, and then narrowed down to 2013. And then I had only, like, you know, a handful of notes, and one of them said Martin Seligman giving a talk in the World Congress of Positive Psychology. So basically, in addition to collecting stuff, if you really want to leverage this, and what I mentioned, like, you know, that what happened with the book with my brother. So basically, when we started writing the book, we went to my Evernote. I chose the tag creativity, and that returned about 450, 500 different notes. So we printed out about 250 of the first ones. And then we made this, like, you know, what I call the kind of psychopath table from them. So we chopped them up into these, like, little individual sentences. And, you know, there were quotes from Monty Python, John Cleese, and like from Stephen King. And there were, like, you know, passages, like some philosophical reflection I'd done, like I dated it in 2008, like, you know, in September or something like that. And a bunch of that stuff went into the book. And obviously none of that would have happened if I hadn't, first of all, written that stuff down when it struck me as interesting. And second, given it that creativity tag, so that 12 years later, when I'm writing a book about creativity, I can actually, you know, draw it out of that system. Now, I was a beta tester with Evernote. I promised to tell you this complicated story. So my Evernote, I ended up having about 22,500 notes in. But unfortunately, like, you know, what's happened to Evernote in recent years is that they've really screwed up their product development, and they've gone into this total feature creep mode, which has rendered the application almost unusable. And what I did a couple of months ago, I think in January this year, I went back to the market and started looking at like Evernote competitors. And eventually, like I tested out everything that's out there, which is what I usually do when I try to find a good app. And I ended up migrating to this app called Bear. And you can see the screenshot there, like, in the left-hand corner of the slide. And Bear, like, the big furry animal, is insane. It's like, it's fantastic. It's like Evernote was in 2008, but even better. So it's like lightning fast. And back in 2008, I was thinking like, that Evernote was like a physical extension of my mind, because I would be able to dig out like information from there in just a couple of seconds. But now, like, just like booting the application on an iPhone takes like 45 seconds. So it's just like, it's totally like, it just sucks, to be honest. Whereas with Bear, the app boots instantly, and you can access any of the notes also instantly. So it means that, like, that when you're using Bear, anything that's stored there is almost as quickly, and sometimes even more quickly, available to you than whatever you can dig out in your biological mind. And it's really, I really, there's this theory called the extended mind hypothesis by David Chalmers and Andy Clark. And I really actually like, I'm a big advocate for that theory. So I actually think it is like comparable to having this stuff in your biological memory, which means that having 20,000 notes stored in the system you can access instantly is just quite grand. And especially if you are into writing things, having this archive and having it tagged by the topics that you're interested in is really, really useful. So to make a long story short, in the collection phase, you're not writing, you're actually like actively holding back from writing and just trying to create like, an archive of enough material that you have something to work with already to begin. And so basically, you can do this by influencing yourself to divergent sources with respect to what you're doing. So something that doesn't really have anything to do with it, but you're excited about, and convergent sources. So basically like things that are actually relevant to whatever you want to write about, which will influence your system one way or the other. Books, discussions, documentaries, movies, music, walking in the park, traveling to strange new cities like Helsinki and stuff like that. Unless you live in Helsinki, so then you can always travel to another strange city like Espoo. Then thinking with other people, hashing on ideas, like doing a little bit more systematic, like, thinking together, for example, using post-it notes or whatever, kind of like, give you new ideas. And then the most important takeaway here, first of all, whenever anything strikes you as interesting, write it down. Write it down always, and stop doing whatever you're doing, write it down. And that's when you'll notice that you'll start building this amazing archive of ideas in no time. And then the second thing, systematically every week, I used to do this in Friday afternoons. Now I do it. And I actually, like, now I've started to do it in Fridays as well, but like for a long time I did it in Mondays, like, the first thing of the day. So basically, like, dedicate half an hour every week to write down those ideas, quotes, anecdotes, stories, whatnot, into your idea archive, and tag them. Give them, whether you're using Bear or Evernote or Nimbus Note, there's a bunch of like, really other pretty cool software there as well. Give them a tag that describes the content, whether it's about creativity, whether it's about neuroscience, whether it's about business, startups, entrepreneurship, whatnot. So that, like, then later on, when you're actually writing about that stuff, it's super easy for you to parse your database and dig out the materials that matter. And that takes us to the second phase. Somebody's asking for Windows or Linux choices. I'm not entirely sure. I think that the silver medalist in my testing was this application called Nimbus Note. So I'm not sure if that's available for PC or not, but like, yeah, that's unfortunate. Like, Bear is not available, I think, outside the Appleverse right now. And Evernote, well, I can't really recommend that. I mean, the feature set is amazing, but the usability is just horrible. So I mean, in that sense. But I mean, if you send me an email, I can look into that. I'll do a little bit of digging. I have the notes, obviously, like in my Bear somewhere. So like, I'll go through the notes and try to figure out like what I could recommend you guys. So once you've collected enough raw material, the next phase still is not to write, but to actually start parsing through what you have in your hand. and so actually on the table there, the photograph, I've dug it out from my Instagram. So that is actually the literal, the psychopath table that I was describing. So that stuff there is the raw material that we printed out from my Evernote to start writing the book about creativity. And then once you've collected enough material, you start like, browsing through what you've got, choosing material, using the tag system to find material that's relevant for what you're writing, and then copying the stuff in your document. And this is now where it's like super helpful if you have the preliminary table of contents ready, because then you can start just like randomly copy pasting stuff that, this could fit here, this could go there. And like I mentioned, like, things are going to change eventually. So for example, when I was writing variously patterned fictions or monikirjoja kuvitelmia, ultimately, like, I had this 30-page passage about Kantian and transcendental philosophy there that my editor felt like, that was just way too complicated for the non-academic reader. And we struck it out. It was painful, but it's still like, it's still a challenging book. And I think with the Kantian thing, it would have sold 3 copies. So anyway, and then she suggested that we actually swapped like the entire first and second parts of the book. So the whole flow in the book is like, not totally different from what I had planned in the beginning, and that's okay. The role of the preliminary table of contents is not to, ink your structure in stone, but to give you a kind of a scaffolding onto which you can then throw out that material that you have gathered. And now when you have like, you have ideas, you have passages, you may have written like, individual short passages, you may have like, stories, anecdotes, something your friend told you once, and you just throw that all out into a single document with a table of contents. And I've had like, a variable experience about this, but by far the most mind-blowing was like, somebody's asking about if I have a copy of the database somehow. So yes, I mean, I'm totally neurotic about backups. I have like this like quadruple backup system. So what happens is everything is stored in the cloud. Everything is stored on 2 computers. Then like one of those computers is doing it's doing a Dropbox backup, and then it's also doing a physical backup. So I should be pretty much all set, like clear. But it's still like it is kind of nerve-wracking, like to think about that those notes might actually like disappear one day. And now that you asked this, I mean, actually now that's spooky, because this system actually was set up for Evernote, and I haven't actually figured out whether this works for Bear. So I'm gonna have to go, because I have like terabytes of data in all my computers, and they're all rigged into this backup system. So I'm gonna have to definitely like make a note about like making sure that Bear's data is also backed up in this fashion. But yeah, like do back up your data. I mean, basically like if somebody actually like killed my Bear or like what I have in Evernote, it would be akin to having a lobotomy. Like so much of the stuff that I can like tap into in terms of cognition right now would be yanked out of me. So not a fun scenario, to be honest. But yeah. So one of the most sort of like exciting experiences I had with this method was like when I was writing this book, my 3rd book called Learning as Fun. So I was at that point like building this learning game unit with Rovio, and they asked me to write a book about the kind of theories like the flow theory, intrinsic motivation theory, and the pedagogical practices like that we employed in building that system. So then I started writing this book, and I had a talk in Tampere on the morning when I had decided to start writing the book. So I had a 2-hour train ride to go to Tampere to speak at this event. This was in 2012, I think, or 2013. And so I hopped into the train, and I had my Evernote. I had all the stuff that I collected, like for example, through that work with Rovio. I had a bunch of like individual passages that I'd written here and there about like my thinking about how learning works, but I didn't have anything ready. So I sat down on the train and then opened up. I actually don't use Word. I use Pages, which is the Apple equivalent of Word, because I'm kind of I'm sort of indoctrinated into this Apple verse. But anyway, so I opened up a blank Pages screen, which as you remember, like back in the day, was a really scary experience for me. So I opened it up and I started parsing through my Evernote and going through my all the stuff, learning pedagogy, like different tags, different ideas, and just copy pasting. I had the synopsis ready. I had the table of content ready. And I was just dropping stuff like randomly into different chapters. So this could go there, this could go there. Something like, hey, I got really carried away. I almost had to hold back from writing and like, just make sure that I'm focused on that. Sometimes you just can't stop it and then you just have to write. But at this point, you'd ideally not yet do any further writing, but just like work with your material. And so I go to Tampere, I give my talk, I continue with this process. And at the point when I later, like 7 hours later in that day, when I step out of the train at the Helsinki railway station, I had more than 100 pages of raw material for that book. And that's in a single span of single day, just by using that material, I have been able to create this semblance of what the book should look like. Obviously, much of that stuff was total crap. This is the point where you're not supposed to be critical yet. I mean, you're just supposed to just more is more. Just put in whatever you have there and try to see if there's any semblance of structure. But that's that's when you get the kind of situation that when you open that screen, you don't have the blank screen, with that hideous monster of the blank screen looking back at you. What you have is 100 pages of ideas. Much of it is crap. Like many of those ideas didn't actually make it into the book, but they might trigger other ideas, and they might trigger other ideas, and eventually it became a pretty okay book. At some point, actually, Cambridge University Press was even thinking about reissuing the book, so that was kind of cool. Didn't come through, but what do you know? So kind of that at that point, when you've collected the data or the material, and you've organized it using these tag systems, and then you have the table of contents as a structure, combining your material with the structure will leave you, I mean, probably I haven't had that experience since or before. So usually I have 20 or 30 pages when I do the first iteration of selection. But even 30 pages of rough material is already quite nice if you're aim to write 200-300 pages of a book actually. But then only at this point, once you've actually collected material and selected what do you think fits best with what you're about to write, and only at this point should we move to where we usually rush to start with, namely sketching. Now sketching, like I mentioned, it's the first love of the creative process. It's by far the most fun you ever have with writing, because then once you get flowing with your writing, you just write stuff here and there, and then just kind of keep on making this, connecting the dots and figuring out ideas. And what I would suggest is actually the way I wrote my first novel was I bought this amazing device called a Free Write. So I actually have 3 of those now. So I have two sort of typewriters and 1 travel version. And they're spectacular writing machines because you can only write forward. You can't edit at all when you use that. So it's kind of like using an old-fashioned typewriter, but with cloud connectivity. And so basically, I used to try to write a novel for 2 decades without ever getting, I think the longest manuscript had about 100 pages. And I was always getting stuck with these narrative, patterns and stuff like that. And then because at that point, in 2016, when I wrote the first full novel, I'd already I've written I don't know, 3 or 4 nonfiction books. So I had this idea that I don't have to write literally. I can actually write scatter here and there. And I started writing a novel like that using the Free Write, just writing a piece about these kids in London and piece about this this stuff happening in California and stuff like that. And then it started piecemeal coming together. And all of a sudden I realized that, oh my goodness, I have a novel that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that was even though I mentioned that it's not yet quite that amazing, quality wise, it was still an amazing experience. That actually, if you don't try to do it linearly, but you do it non-linearly, so you write something in the middle, you might have the ending ready on day 2, then you start in the beginning, and that way whenever you have that dedicated time to write, you can always write something. And what I did a couple of months ago is that sometimes we're just tired. Sometimes we blank out, and our mind just sometimes we every single creative process has these moments where you feel that everything that you're doing is just utter crap, and that's part of the process. And if you don't feel like that, you're probably a robot and not a human. So at some point you'll just lose faith, and at that point doing something different might actually be highly helpful. And what I did in January this year, that has really given me a lot of new inspiration in life. I printed out this A4 piece of paper in my writing room, and then basically I just kind of wrote down bullet points what can I do when I sit down by the typewriter. I can write, a particular story. I can write a particular, nonfiction stuff. But I can also do stuff like, what are called writing prompts. So I have a link in the end of this presentation, to one of these websites where you just have ideas that you can start sort of like hashing out, writing from. And you can write a blog post. So you could make a kind of sort of like pseudo to-do list where you write down the things that you could do when you sit by your writer. So you don't always have to write the book. You can also write something totally different, something totally divergent even, as long as you dedicate those 1 hour or 2 hours a day and make sure that you then spend those 2 hours writing so that you actually have this bracket and this routine of Stephen King's being a writer by, writing. But then when you're working with the first sketch, when you have the raw material there, just finding the bits and pieces that make your heart sing usually is the best strategy, at least in my experience. Just adding text, interacting, having a dialogue with what you've already written, going here and there and everywhere. And that way you usually maintain a high level of interest also in writing. And I think that interest and the amount of flow you have when you write also translates to the reader. Flow has this peculiar, kind of infectious quality, that when you're writing or when you're giving a talk or when you're performing a musical instrument, if you're actually in flow, that sort of translates to other people as well. And then the important, this is why free writes are so amazing, and there's a classical version of that technology as well called an alpha write or alpha smart, actually, I think that's one. So basically, don't stop to edit. This is not yet the time to get critical on your text. It's still you're still in a kind of a pseudo collection phase where instead of collecting random stuff, you're collecting stuff inside your manuscript. So just write and keep on pushing forward. And that's why a free write is such an amazing tool, because with the free write, you can, you're forced to do that. You can't go back. You make a typo, well, hoo-hoo with that, you have a typo in your text. And there's no other way to fix that in a free write apart from deleting everything you've written since. And that gives you a very peculiar writing experience where you really get into the flow of things rather than spending a lot of time correcting typos and stuff like that. And rest assured, you'll get to correct typos plenty enough later on. But at this point, just keep on writing, keep on pushing on, keep on just trying to create a kind of a semblance of a kind of a haphazard manuscript that has some beginning, some middle part, and some end. And that, like I said, that's sort of that's where I'm at, for example, with my fictitious work, because I don't have the skill set yet, how to really make them work as something refined. So with amateurs, you stop at sketching. So once you have something that has all these parts and some cohesion, then you stop. But if you really want to do something publishable, something that really a ton of people might want to read, that's not enough. You really then have to start honing in on what is it you want to say? What is really essential? What is needed here? What can you throw away? So at this point, you could think about it that in collection, you're just amassing this this huge pile of ideas. In sketching, you're sort of focusing on what is interesting about that pile. And then when you move to refining, you start really crystallizing that I don't need, that I don't need, that I don't need, but this is what I'm really trying to say. And it's I think it was, I'm not sure if it was Anne Lamott, but one of these amazing, no, it wasn't her, but some author whose name I don't remember once said that there's a huge difference between writing a book that's 200 pages long and writing a book that's 600 pages long where you've deleted 400 pages. So in both cases, you have an object that has 200 pages, but the actual end result, what is the level of depth and understanding behind the book is tremendously better in the case where you've actually edited out 400 pages. And that's where you need to get next. But one more thing, so I've already emphasized this, but before you start writing, make sure you have enough material. Don't start sketching before you have collected enough material, because that'll it'll just be a kind of a mating call for the writer's block monster. And I, at least personally, would never want to see that horrible thing again in my life. When you go to refining, you move from productive mode to edit mode. So basically you start evaluating, and this is where you really start being critical about what you've written. And I love this saying that Stephen King quotes on writing by this guy called John Gould. Write with the door closed, rewrite with the door open. So when you're doing the first sketch, don't show it to anybody. Don't even talk about it to anybody. I mean, I'm already like taking a tremendous risk here that I actually even told you guys that I've written these sketches of novels, because it's just like, it's like super scary and bordering on like totally idiotic, because it starts to affect your thinking. So when you're sketching, keep it to yourself. Like, yank the door shut. Don't show it to anybody. Don't talk to anybody. But then when you start editing your text, first of all, I mean, try to edit it into a shape that would be like, as crystallized, as coherent as possible, but then bring in the crowd. And the important thing, I think, with all creative endeavors is that they're never solitary affairs, even though you have to start, in a solitary fashion, unless you're in a rock band. So basically, first, when you start thinking about how to make your work better, you have to show it to people, but then you should show it to people who are actually relevant for your work. So don't show if you're writing a technical paper on some like business models or something like that, don't show it to your poet friends, because they'll be like, ugh. Show it to somebody who understands business models. And if you're writing poetry, don't show it to your I don't know, audiobook only friends who just read self-help or listen to that on audiobooks. Just try to figure out what is the target audience, and be mindful of that, and ask for comments from people who actually might be able to be interested in what you're writing about, and might also have the capability of pointing out where you're not doing a great job. And then work on the material, edit, and try to throw out, try to consult every single piece of what you've written, and if it doesn't need to be there, do yourself a favor and throw it out. Keep it simple, stupid. One of the most important rules in any creative endeavor. Or as Einstein is allegedly has said, everything should be done as simply as possible, but not simpler. So basically, I don't actually have been able to trace that quote to Einstein, so it's a kind of a gimmick to drop it here. But anyway, I think it's a good quote. So in that sense, that you draw out the stuff that doesn't actually need to be there, but make sure that you don't get carried too much out in with this editing spree, and all of a sudden you don't have anything left in your manuscript. And then rewrite and edit more, ask for comments, and keep on rinsing and repeat this. And then when you have something that you feel like that, this could be it, then sleep over it. Or do what Stephen King does, when he is happy with a manuscript, he puts it in a desk drawer for at least 3 to 6 months and just lets it sit there, and he aggressively tries not to touch that manuscript, not even think about it through that time. So you get distance to what you've written. And I've never been able to do that. I usually when I've written the first good manuscript version, I put it out for comments, and then I drop it for a month and a half, and during that time my readers get to read the manuscript, they come back with comments, and then after 6 to 8 weeks I come back to the manuscript, and armed with those new comments, I start refining and doing the final edits under that. But at least sleep over it. Take some time away from the writing and try to think about whether it actually works. And I found Stephen King has found the 3 to 6 months to be a good one. I found the 6 to 8 weeks to be a good one. 3 days might work for you, but just take some time to make sure that before you rush to finalize your work, you have distanced yourself from what you've been doing. And then we get to that, the exhilarating and scary and intimidating moment of actually saying that something is done. So once you've taken your time from your work, once you've done the kind of final rounds of edits, review the work, read it through from one cover to the other as if it was an actual book. And at this point, don't start to edit it anymore. If you've been so happy about it, don't go back to editing, because then you might end up like George Lucas with Star Wars, that you just keep on. And I think this is the biggest, second biggest pitfall of any creative endeavor. So the first one is writer's block. The second one is this kind of siren call of endless editing. So basically just going, because I mean, let's face it, there is no creative work that would be free of mistakes. There is no creative work that would be perfect. Da Vinci corrected Mona Lisa through decades, and he was never actually quite happy about it. James Joyce's Ulysses, which is like, like unanimously voted usually as the most important book ever written, has like thousands of like typos and stupid mistakes in it. So you're gonna have mistakes in your work, and it's okay. And it's kind of like, I really like this like paraphrase from this this poet Paul Valery. So he wrote like, poem is never finished, and then W.H. Auden added to that like, that a poem is never finished, only abandoned. And I think that goes for a book as well. At some point, you just let go. You let it, out the door. You let it spread its wings and fly out into the world and do whatever it does. And then some of the books you write, they will find an audience, and others won't find an audience. And some of them might touch, the lives of like, thousands of people, and some of them might touch the lives of like one or two people even. But even that could be grand. Like, just having an effect in the life of one person, like, for the better, might already be ground shaking. Who knows? But you have to let it go. You have to let it into the world and let it do its job. And then your job is to move on. And you have the stuff that you've collected, and you have, all of that stuff that you've, put in your system on all of these new ideas, and maybe already have a new book up and coming. So at this point, when you come to the finalization, I think there's only two things you can do anymore, or you should do. So one is, I always give myself the luxury of putting one, kind of like finishing touch on my work. So once I'm done with it and I've slept over it, and I come back to that, if there's something that really, really peeves me, I'll fix that, but only one thing. And if I'm starting to find 2 or 3 or 4, I don't go back to refining. I don't go back to editing. I go back to square one. And as you can remember the scribble that Paavo drew about our book, that's how it works. I mean, if you're not happy about the end result, go all the way back to collection and start just like digging out new stuff, and then select, and then do some more sketching, and then refine, and then ask for comments, and then sleep over it and see what happens. Are you happy enough to put a finishing touch on it and to let it go? And let me tell you, at some point, I mean, you'll never, ever be fully happy about whatever you write. But at some point, you might be just happy enough that you can put, you can let it out to your publisher and tell them like, that I'm ready now, like, with this, let's print it. Or you can put it out to like, whatever format, like, you're going to publish your work in. And it's grand. Then, then that part of your creative process is done. It's out there, it spreads its wings, and it does whatever it does, and it's out of your hands. And then it's like, then it's up to the world to figure out how it interacts with your creative endeavor. And the only thing you can do from there on out is then move forward and then start writing whatever you're going to write next. So a couple of tools I want to share. So Bear, I mentioned already, is amazing. It's at www.bear.app. Try it out if you're on a Mac or an iPhone. If not, then like I said, like just send me a note, and I promise I'll look up for a PC alternative. Write-Room is an amazing piece of software, like kind of like blank screen. Usually, I mean, you have this now in Word and Pages as well. Like you don't really need Write-Room. I personally prefer it because it's like a kind of a no bells and whistle, kind of like just blank screen and text and nothing more. Then I mean, obviously free writes are pretty expensive, and they're kind of like kind of posh, but I love those. Like I love those so much. They're just amazing piece of technology. So you can find them at getfreewrite.com, and then the image there is their new version, which is a travel version that I actually like participated in a Kickstarter when on an airplane on the way to New York. And I was thinking that that's going to be a groundbreaking piece of technology for me, because at that point I was actually lugging the actual typewriter, like this huge device, with me on an airplane. Turns out Corona, and like then I have the travel thing sitting right there, and like I haven't been able to travel at all with it yet. But looking forward to that happening one day. And then there's like it's not Alpha Write, but I have a typo there, so I think it's Alpha Smart Neo is the kind of like 1980s, like you can find those on eBay. They cost like $20 or something, and it's almost the same idea as with free writes. Then somebody's recommending Scrivener. I don't really have much experience with that myself, but I've heard good things about it, so definitely like worth looking into. Then if you're doing scientific work, obviously, like probably everybody has some kind of reference archival system. I use Bookends; it's good. There's also like EndNote, like there's a ton of like great options there as well. And by the way, FreeWrite also has a free online version of their workflow called Sprinter. So if you don't want to like, spell out for the actual device, you might want to take a look at Sprinter at sprinter.getfreewrite.com. And then, Google Books, I just slapped it there because I think that's also an amazing, like, because like when you're collecting stuff, and especially like, if you're collecting, anecdotes and quotes and stuff like that, at some point, like, you don't want to be too critical in the beginning. But the problem is like, as Aristotle famously said, you shouldn't trust everything you read online. So basically, like, there's a bunch of like, quotes that have been attributed to people who actually never said that. And I found Google Books to be like, a really indispensable tool that when I found, an inspiring quote and I put it in my archive and then dug it out into a piece of book, before I actually release a new book, I go through all of these attributions and quotes, and I go to Google Books and I rummage through the kind of like online library before I'm sure that I've been able to attribute the quotes correctly. And I actually didn't used to do this in the beginning. So a couple of my first books actually have, well, let's be honest, they have a couple of pretty bad misattributions in them. And I learned this the hard way. And I just want to share this with you guys, like, that when you collect a lot of stuff, you have to be uncritical about it. And if you're uncritical about it, some of the stuff might actually turn out to be backwards. And that's why in the refining phase, you have to be super critical about the stuff that you put into your writing, especially if you're attributing it to somebody else. And then finally, like I mentioned, writing prompts, I've just like dug out one link for you guys to tap into. This is maybe more for fiction, but like, why not? Maybe you could use this for nonfiction as well. And if if you want, like, I can look up for some other tools and tricks and stuff like that. If you want to dive deeper into this. So once again, you can always reach me at lauri.järvilehto@aalto.fi, and I'm happy to engage. I'm super bad with all other forms of communication. I'm really good at email. So like, if you send me an email, I'm happy to engage in thinking further, like, how to help you guys. And one final remark. If you want some key takeaways from today's talk, start with collecting. Don't hold off from sketching until you have enough stuff in your hands. And leave out critique. And this is the paradox of creativity. Leave out critique, leave out convergence when collecting and playing with your material. Just fool around with it, like, have a blast. But when you're refining and editing and finalizing your material, you have to flip on the super critical mode. You have to, like, interrogate almost every word. Should this be here? Is this accurate? Is this the right word? And the other book that I mentioned that I really recommend is this classic by Strunk and White, The Elements of Style. It's a really small book and something that really, like, sort of, it basically goes through the basic grammar and punctuation and stuff like that. And that's like a really valuable toolkit for every single writer, because let's face it, we all make typos, we all make punctuation, grammar mistakes. These guys can at least help you avoid some of the most blatant ones. So highly recommend it. It's like, I don't know, 80 pages or something like that. It's like super fast read. And this is something that everybody, well, it's like 100 pages, but still, like, everybody who aspires to be a writer should read that book. And then choose the tools that work best for you, and ultimately write what you care about. Don't write for your career, don't write for your job, don't write to impress others. Write about things that you love, because that will show through. That will actually, like, make your writing so much better, no matter how much bells and whistles you put on that, if the reader can actually, like, see that you have been excited about what you've been writing. So that's all I have to say for today. Thank you so much for participating in this workshop. I have been, like, scared to death and also, like, quite excited about having the opportunity to share these ideas and these tools with you. I hope that they will be useful for you in your future writing endeavors. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks a lot, Lauri. I hope you all learned a lot today. If you're interested in learning more about topics like entrepreneurship and sustainability, make sure to keep an eye on our website at avp.aalto.fi and also follow us on social media. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. My name is Tommy Buman. This was How to Write a Book by Aalto Ventures Program. Happy writing, everyone, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.